welcome again to Trust Conference. We're really excited to have you with us. We got a fantastic number of people reaching out from all corners of the world, and we want to talk about climate. And it's obviously a very fitting moment for us to have a conversation on the back of COP26. And we want to really reframe climate during this conversation as a human right risk, and in the hope that this actually might propel stronger and better action. And before we get into the conversation, I have a fantastic lineup of speakers with me. Let's just go into a video explainer that sets the scene of the conversation that we are just about to have.
Ngay to yung John lalo may alabandrik. Echolak jignya ngay na yung paratalangan. Agalak to menino ko tagun medyo to kapur. Yakamon meninaw no to yung jaga kay. Junian John ran kay ailing kin raberong. Chaku ak icip kanan calak jignya ngay kanan talaga. Ngay kanan perwot jignya. Unan John menino kau tatak. Kana kay lung ne tay mayo. Merong Jimyono ne ay to kuncin per emelak Jimyon ne kay no kana kay yul biru air kilibulak kay raja level right chukuno chon ipeneni ratal ramarong war waling tangan yon.
And then they removed the piece of land that used to be over here. So over here used to be our outside bathroom, and then it was knocked away. This used to be a basketball court area for small kids, but it destroyed. All of this area was impacted and it was flooded. 60% of the community here on Ibai has been damaged or affected by the rising seas and climate change.
So a powerful section of a documentary that we actually shot in the Marshall Islands, and you've seen the devastation and the impact on the environment precisely in the Marshall Islands. And I really would like to start with Senator Heine, who's also been the president in the past of the country, and really looking at the human impact in the Marshall Islands. Is one of the 4 atoll nations in the world, countries that really build the entire societies on coral and sand rims of sunken volcanoes. The impact of climate change is clearly shown in the video that we've just watched, Senator Heine. Could you speak to the human rights threats that have been posed by climate change to your country, the Marshall Islands?
Thank you, Antonio. I would like to start by thanking the organizers of this event for bringing us together to talk about the important topic of climate change as a human rights risk. Climate change is indeed the greatest threat facing humanity, affecting livelihoods, food security, health, life, and culture. Human rights has been at the forefront of recent discussions on climate change ever since the emergence of scientific evidence relating to the impact of climate change on our livelihoods in the context of sea level rise and the threat it continues to represent. The Marshall Islands, as you saw in the video, is a chain of coral atolls. One of, as the video mentioned, 4 atoll nations in the world. And atoll nations have no higher ground. All land masses are approximately 2 meters above sea level. Recent studies have shown that by mid-century, 96% of Majuro, which is the capital of the Marshall Islands, is at risk of frequent flooding, while 37% of the city's existing buildings face permanent inundation in the absence of any form of adaptation. So with sea level rise, countries on the front line stand to lose their land masses. Our EEZ zone will also diminish. Language, culture, effectively our identity and our way of life will be lost. Speaking of risks, there is nothing riskier than losing all of your sovereignty, your existence, really. The question is who is responsible? We know that atoll countries like the Marshall Islands contribute minuscule to the greenhouse gas emissions, something like 0.0001 or something like that. Yet our health is compromised. We're being forced to change our lifestyles, even forced to move from our ancestral lands. Our rights to live as a people, culture, and country in our ancestral land is a human rights guaranteed by the International Convention on Human Rights. Migration as an option is not as simple as some might think. It is not a question of picking up and settling in another country. Our lives are connected to our lands in intimate ways. We were taught growing up about the importance of land as, not only precious economically and socially, but also integral to our identity and culture. Having a land tenure system that is complicated and unique require experiencing and learning about it from early on. So for example, we have, each of our piece of land has a name and is owned and cared for by a family or a clan dating back many generations. Before last names were even used, people's identities were attached to their ancestral lands. So what happens to our ancestral lands affect the owners of the land in deep ways, not only economically, but spiritually, and emotionally. That is why it is very difficult to contemplate the possibility that climate change might force us to leave our ancestral lands behind, or worse, sea level rise might submerge our island nation and with it our sovereignty as a state.
And Senator Heine, this is obviously the core of the matter. We're talking about human rights, and you just touched on the point about having to leave, being forced to giving up on not only the livelihood but also the history and the culture. I will come back to you in just a minute, but I want to stick to the human angle here and move to another geography in Kenya, because as we know, you touched on a very interesting angle: the disparity between the emissions and the implications and the cost and the impact of climate. And we know, to your point, Senator Heine, about the impact that often really affects the most vulnerable people, the ones who are, especially at times, even indigenous people and local communities. So I really wanted to hear from Ikal, who is based in Kenya. Ikal, we COP26, having just ended, we heard a lot of commitments being made at a global level. How can we ensure that the voices of the indigenous people, the local communities, are heard and their rights to self-determination are not impeded by climate change?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers, Senator Heine, for highlighting the struggles amongst communities in the Marshall Islands. Just like the island communities, many communities in Africa, and I speak from a pastoralist population, are suffering the impacts of an extreme, climate crisis. We find ourselves currently suffering an extreme drought. We have not had rains in the last 6 months or so. We've always lived in a predominantly dry area, but this, we get our long and short rains during certain times, and now we're just seeing months to years of extreme drought. Which means, land use change is affecting it. But to go to the question after the COP26, the focus on the climate finance is one thing, and we've had this before. Like many other things, the business as usual, the way we're in an economic, in a way of that the discussions are made and are heard by people in powerful positions without really understanding what does that mean? What is the sort of financing that we are asking for? What is the sort of financing that should happen? And many times the measure is because you've given a little community group a few $1,000s, you think that is it. I think we've got to look at climate finance from two different levels. The fact that the extraction that has happened within the global south is really where the problem began. And so the climate finance has got to be able to be addressing that injustice first. Because you're not just giving people resources to mitigate something that they have actually exacerbated. They're just victims of a lot of things that have happened in the global north. So the thinking around the climate finance has got to come from a place of we are actually first setting it right. And then after that, when we're saying, how do we make sure that we are addressing issues of mitigation and adaptation. But even then, you see it's a lot of droplets. And even in the conversation of climate finance, there's a tendency of talking about climate finance to the global south and to the island nations, indigenous areas. But then that financing is really put in the hands and the companies of global north partners. So in the end, it is not direct support to the global south and to, like in this case in Africa, the channels that are used are again are channels controlled and everything. Eventually, what really comes into the continent is a droplet. I think we've got to really then ask, what is the sort of financing that is happening? Are the local communities, indigenous people on the table? So it is not, and especially at a time when there is a lot of dance between corporations and state, we find then that you find that the citizens of the countries are actually left out. And so there's got to be a lot of effort in trying to make sure that communities are supported to help themselves, because they know what they want and how then they can be able to design and define that through the various processes, I think.
Thank you, Ikal. I mean, the point about finance, the point about having a seat at the table, obviously, are points that we've seen being extensively discussed during COP26. I would like to hear the legal perspective from Jorian. Jorian, you are a practicing lawyer. You have experience in advising multinational companies on human rights issues. What trends are you observing when it comes to climate, on whether climate change, for example, is part now of these human rights issues that corporate actors are now having to factor more and more into their business case?
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. And it's really great to be talking about the legal aspects after having heard such powerful testaments of how important this debate is. And I have to say, taking human rights seriously was not standard practice for businesses in the past. But there have been very, very successful attempts to change that. So there was a very genuine concern that this accountability gap should be accounted for, in the sense that, investments of companies in the global south were protected, but then human rights were not protected as much as the investments themselves. So that's where the Ruggie principles and the United Nations guiding principles came in. And it's really a global framework which sets out that companies have an obligation to protect and respect human rights. And that means that multinational companies are very, very much involved with human rights nowadays. We have those Ruggie principles, we have the United Nations guiding principles, and there's very much talk of national and EU legislation which encompasses this obligation to respect human rights in national law. So different from 20, 30 years ago, international companies are very much involved with human rights. They perform human rights due diligence. They really want to prevent any human rights impacts from happening. If not, they can be prosecuted. This happened in France, for example. It's now happening in Sweden, or they can be sued in civil courts. It happens a lot. So they're actively acting on this. And the picture is different for climate change, in the sense that for climate change, not until very long ago, we had only very vague international commitments They were not binding for states and not at all binding for companies. So in a way, companies were off the hook under international and national climate laws. And some very clever people at the UN and NGOs and in academia thought, well, what if we change the narrative around climate change? What if we start considering climate change as a human rights issue? And I think having heard the testimonies of Ikal and Hilda, that is not a ridiculous idea, right? There is this very logical link between climate change and human rights, in a sense that climate change really impacts on human rights, right to life, right to private life, right to cultural identity. So what if we start considering climate change as a human rights risk? The logical consequence of doing that is that companies need to start considering climate change as serious as they are considering other potential human rights impacts. And we've seen UN organs starting to develop this narrative, and we've seen national courts starting to making this link between climate change and human rights. And by doing so, it's now become very hard for companies to deny that climate change is a human rights issue. And the result of that is that companies do need to factor in human rights, and therefore also do need to factor in climate change into their operations and their policies. So changing that narrative, which is the key topic of today's debate, has made all the difference in terms of the approach companies now need to follow.
Thank you, Jorian. And you mentioned, obviously, the concept of liability or corporate liability from a legal perspective. I would like to move on to Rachel Barr, L'Oreal, because obviously we talked about companies. Rachel, we heard about the concept of changing the narrative and looking at climate as an issue that brings liability and risk from a legal perspective. How can companies prepare themselves for this potential legal challenge, and how can they address the situation using the very powerful tool that they have in hands? I know that L'Oreal obviously tackled this from a gender perspective, in particular when it comes to specific regions of the world. Could you share your perspective on this?
Sure, Antonio. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting us. Well, as you can imagine, as a global beauty company, we've long-standing commitment with regard to human rights, and especially with a focus on women's rights and the empowerment of women all over the world. We do activate very pragmatically within and outside a company different complementary levers to do that. We have, of course, a strong equality policy, achieving today great results in terms of great representation of women in high leadership position. We do also have an endowment fund, the L'Oréal Fund for Women, which is dedicating to the 50 million euros to grassroots organizations all around the world to support and empower women that are facing difficult situations. Or again, the action of our L'Oréal Foundation, which is historically supporting women, for example, in scientific careers or enhancing social inclusion through the métier of beauty. So women empowerment and women's rights and human rights is not something new, and it's something that we consider very seriously and contributing at different levels internally and externally to the company. Climate change as well has long been part of our and central to our group sustainability strategy and has been one of our great priority in terms of sustainable transformation. We have a long-standing commitment to reduce our GHG emissions. For example, in 2020, we had already reduced by more than 80% in absolute term our GHG emission, while our production was increasing by 30%. We have a 1.5 degrees scenario trajectory in place, so that's to reduce by 50% per unit of product our GHG emission, all scopes by 2030. So this is really a challenge that we take super seriously. Both climate change and human rights. This is more recent, the decision to combine these two topics together And this is something that we experience very concretely and in a very tangible way along our supply chains. As a beauty company, we source most of our ingredients from nature. 60% of our ingredients are today what we call nature-based, so either coming from agriculture or from wild picking. And we know that most of the workforce along this natural-based supply chain are women. And what we saw quite early on, and that was 10 years ago, was the impact of climate change, new environmental conditions on the conditions of women, especially in this sector of activity. They were facing an increasing of their domestic workload because they are culturally mostly in charge of water and wood collection for the household. They are also in charge of food security for themselves, of course, but also for their family. And with the impact of climate change, with this environmental crisis, what we saw along the supply chain is that their livelihood was suffering, their access to health, their access to food, the education of their children was really impacted directly by climate change. Just let me give a very concrete example of that. We source shea butter from Burkina Faso in West Africa. This is a very iconic ingredient in cosmetic products. And there in Burkina Faso, women, she collection and she processing is really something that women are very a part of, if not only. They do most of the harvesting and processing of the shea butter. And what we see is that they are already very impacted by the climate change due to water scarcity in the area of production of this shea. They sacrifice the time that they dedicate to their job of shea butter productions and also the education of their daughters to walk each day and each week further to collect water and to go to the next well. We see also that desertification, deforestation is directly threatening the shea forest, which is their unique source of revenue, their unique source of livelihood. So in front of this context and new difficulty that are particularly important for women there, we saw an opportunity and an urgent need to support these women that are facing this new condition, developing some dedicated projects that are combining women empowerment, but also adaptation to this new condition that are imposed by climate change. So we are, of course, working on traceability, fair income, pre-financing of their crops, but also developing some specific mechanisms that are related to the new risks that they are facing due to climate change, such as micro-insurance schemes, for example, clean cook stove or facilitated access to clean energy to reduce the time and the money they dedicate to wood collection and wood use and free time so as to develop more of their activity that generate revenues, and now acting as well on the diversification of this source of revenue so that to provide better resilience to these communities, not only with women, but with men as well, and to really adapt to the new conditions that are rising. So this is the kind of gender inclusive approach that we try to do in every of our sustainable sourcing program, in particular in countries that are already strongly affected by climate change and where strong gender gaps still remain, because we know that gender inequality are exacerbated. And this is for us a question of liability, of course, as for any company, but also a question of great responsibility and also business continuity. So this is something that we experience directly as well with our stakeholders along our value chain.
Thank you, Rachel. I would like to go back to the Marshall Islands with Senator Heine and really look at some of the steps that you've taken. You talked about the risk, you talked about the human rights implications, you talked about the threat of losing an entire country and its culture and its values. What steps have you taken until now to really bring this to the forefront of the agenda?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, like any other small island countries, we have taken our case to the international community. We have been very active in the UNFCCC process. There we helped to form the High Ambition Coalition that has been very effective in securing the Paris Agreement. In fact, we continue to convene that group as one of our efforts to bring awareness and action in this area of climate change. We have also tried to lead from the front in terms of making commitments that are required under the Paris Agreement. We were one of the first to file our national determined contributions early on. We launched our net zero commitment by 2050, also very early. So we've been leading by example to try to show that if we can do these things, other countries and other leaders should be able to do these as well. In addition to working through the UNFCCC process and the United Nations, we've also gone to the Human Rights Council. We became member of the Human Rights Council a year ago. This is our second year as member of the council. And the reason we went to become a member was to bring attention of the council to the plight of our people impacted by climate change. We've also had experience with nuclear legacy from the US nuclear testing program in our island. So that's another reason we went to become member of the Human Rights Council. But it's through our membership and our really advocating for human rights to appoint a special rapporteur for climate change and human rights that they finally appointed or designate a rapporteur or that position as of this past September. So there will be a special rapporteur from Human Rights Council that look into this very area of human rights and climate change. So our government has been very, very active internationally, but also our non-government organizations, women's group, as well as youth group, have gone around the world and talked about our human rights issues and our climate change, the impacts of climate change on our people. So these being active out there, I think it's got the word out, trying to get people to be sensitized as well as to be aware of what is happening. Because I think there are still people who are questioning the reality of climate change and whether or not it's really happening. And our mission is to tell people that it is here, we are experiencing it, and unless other people and other countries do their part, some of us are going to be, quite affected. In fact, we would lose our homeland. So we haven't been sitting around. We have been quite active in getting the word out there in the international community.
Thank you, Senator Heine. Ikal, one of the way forward is green energy, and we talked a lot about it at COP, and we're going to be talking about the issue of just transition later on today. This is one of your areas of interest, the energy transition, and there are risks because obviously we know that shifting to more renewable forms of energy has a risk in terms of employment, in terms of also human rights implications. Can you please share your thoughts based on the work that you're doing on the ground in Kenya?
Thank you. Yes, our work really began as Friends of Lake Turkana through questioning the hydroelectric dams. We've seen the damage in, the Mekong River. You've seen the damage in many parts in Latin America, in Africa, of a huge displacement of people, livelihoods lost, identity, a sense of belonging, and this has gone on from the indigenous communities in the US and until now we're seeing it in the global South. So that is where our premise begins. So with this conversation of a just transition, you can see a discussion that focuses on the transition of technology, but it does not talk about the socioeconomic transition. And you cannot, the fossil fuel industry was not only It's not only a bad economy, a bad way of developing energy because of the technology, but it is also a very extractivist model. So you have this sense that everyone is saying, shift to renewables, but that same renewables, we've seen it with, the death of Bata Caceres in Honduras was because she was fighting a hydroelectric dam in Honduras. And now with the current shift, it means that there's going to be an increase in minerals that is needed for the renewable energies. DRC is a country that has seen extreme, climate crisis. You have the recent volcanoes, you have the deforestation, but this is also the center of lithium, cobalt, aluminium, copper. A few days ago, I looked at an energy magazine and they were talking about the number of copper mines that now have to be opened up for us to meet the needs of the energy transition. And if you look at where these resources are, it is the global south. It is Africa, it is Chile, it is really the continuous development of the global north at the expense of the global south. And this is going to be seen as we do this. It was interesting to see, the Sami people, who are pastoralist communities in Norway, who went to court against their government for taking up land to build a huge wind farm that in the end meant that the reindeer movement, the migration of reindeer was affected. They won the case a few weeks ago. And now they're saying because nobody consulted them. So again, we're not only going for us to really recognize and be part of, and yes, we agree that we need the energy transition, but it is critical for it to be a just energy transition that not only continues to extract from poor people, from local communities whose lands are where they earn a livelihood, to develop an industry that leaves them out. So this is a very critical part that really has to be. So we've got to really say it's a shift in business and really putting power in the hands of communities to determine how the extraction of those rare minerals happens, when it happens, and it goes back to a very, very picture that stuck in my head for a long time when Greta had her great work and she was talking about we need to shift to renewable energy. But if you look at the children younger than her in the DRC who are being used to mine those minerals at the for the need for this shift, it really speaks to. And this young man was saying, Greta, we are trying to make to mine very fast so that we can meet your demands, and that is not that really is leaving a lot of the African children behind.
Very powerful context there, Ikal. Thank you for raising that. And obviously, we're going to be talking about the issue of just transition also later on throughout the day. But Ikal, you also mentioned this very latest case of climate litigation. So I really would like to bring the legal perspective with Jorian again. And obviously, Jorian, we can narrow the gap between climate change and human rights through legislation, through the law. We know that there have been some attempts happening, especially in the Netherlands. So I just wondering if you could give us some perspectives of where we are in terms of climate litigation, what trends are emerging, how do you see the picture going forward?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I think climate change laws and climate change legislation can be very effective if these laws are well drafted and if they contain clear obligations. Instead of vague aspirations. And I think this is the crux. Until very recently, hardly any country had a climate change law. And if there was a climate change law, it would be aspirational and there would be some vague language in there. And there's many reasons for that. There's competing interest. There is the fear of politicians to really take a step forward on this. But the conclusion is, there is government inaction. Whatever the reason for it, governments, the international community, but also at a national level, fail to act in what is needed to combat climate change. And so yes, at that point, confronted with that inaction, courts have interfered. And there's several drivers for that interference. And that inaction, that government inaction that I spoke about, is very much a first and very important driver of courts stepping in. You see this happen more often. There's of course a division between what the legislators should do and what the courts should do. But if the legislator is silent, but there is a pressing social need for something to develop and for the law to develop, then courts will step in. You should not underestimate the power that courts have in that respect. And judges are in the end people too, and they also see on a daily basis what's happening with climate change. Now, a second very important driver is that NGOs have really been instrumental in changing that narrative that we just spoke about. The very concept that climate change is a human rights issue, which was very novel 10 years ago, but which has slowly gained traction. And then suddenly, I think there is really a paradigm shift over the last couple of years where this has become really a hallmark of international human rights law. And states such as the Marshall Islands have been very instrumental in that. And it was already mentioned that we now even have a special rapporteur for climate change and human rights. So that shows how far we've got on this issue. And really NGOs have been an incredibly important driver of that. And so using that narrative, climate change is a human rights issue, once we then can argue that a state or even a company breaches a human right, it is not that difficult to connect that human rights breach to a breach of an open norm of national private law. So most private laws in the world, they work with unwritten standards of care, general duties of conduct. It's not that hard to argue that violating human rights is a breach of the general standard of care in society, and is in fact unlawful as a matter of private law. So we've seen cases, and the Netherlands is really where I come from, has really been a front runner jurisdiction in this respect. We've had the Agenda case where NGOs managed to have the Supreme Court of the Netherlands find that the Dutch state should act on climate change, because otherwise it's actually breaching human rights. And at the time, people thought, well, this is an outrageous judgment and we won't see this happening anywhere. And in fact, what we've seen is that it's now happening in Belgium, it's happening in France, it has happened in Germany. So there's really a paradigm shift there where courts are actually following suit. And of course, we can...
Jorian,
yeah.
Is the legal sector prepared for this shift?
Sorry, is the legal sector prepared for this shift that's happening pretty fast, as you are describing? Yeah, that's a very relevant question. So what we see is that the NGOs, they're very, very, very effective in sharing their knowledge when it comes to these strategic litigation. So for example, the NGOs who brought the case against the Dutch government and against the Dutch oil major, they put all of their submissions online in English so that everybody can basically use them. And there's manuals on how to do climate change litigation. So they have an incredible amount of knowledge about how this works. And then as corporate lawyers and in-house lawyers, we need to adapt. We need to learn the basics of international climate change law. How does this work? We need to learn the basics of international human rights law, which is really not part of our standard curriculum if we go to law school. But it's going to be very important also as a business lawyer to work on this. And yes, you can have a debate about whether this is healthy, whether the court should do this. Isn't this for the legislator? Fair enough. That's a fair debate to have. But I think the lesson is don't underestimate the power of the courts and power of the law when the legislator is paralyzed by inaction.
Thank you, Jorian. Really interesting perspective of how the legal sector itself is adapting to these emerging challenges. Going back to the corporate angle, Rachel, we were talking about some of the initiatives and the action that L'Oréal was propelling from a gender perspective when it comes to climate as a human rights risk, hearing that you're combining the two activities internally, which is really, really interesting. Question for you is, what concrete actions, you mentioned some actions about the certification and other initiatives that you are practically taking, but what concrete actions other companies can also take to ensure that climate change becomes a human rights priority going forward? And how many other companies are taking the approach that you've described at L'Oréal? Is this an individual case, or is this a trend within the industry where you sit?
Thanks for the question, Antonio. Well, I won't be able to speak about other companies, but in our specific case, due to our historical commitment to the empowerment of women and women's rights respect, it was very natural acknowledging the figures and all the effects of climate change on the gender and the women conditions and the difficulty for them to access to their rights due to climate change, to extend our human rights approach and our women's rights approach to the question of climate change. If I just quote a few figures coming from the UN, today they represent 70% of people living on less than $1 a day. They're in charge of over 80% of the agricultural production, which we know as the sector which is more impacted by the climate change. They spend triple the time collecting water, but they only own 2% of the land and receive less than 10% of the income from the exploitation of that land. So we made one of our priority to specifically support women addressing this condition, this new condition which are imposed by climate change. There can be a question of liability as described by Jorian, but in our case, that was really part of our responsibility policy and really a natural extension of our human rights and women's rights policy. To mainstream the gender dimension into our climate approach, we've decided to act at two levels. First, within our value chain, so putting in place some comprehensive project addressing the question of women empowerment alongside to climate change adaptation. This is something that I gave the example of the sourcing of shea butter in Burkina Faso, but this is something we replicate as soon as we can and as often as necessary in different parts of the world, India, Latin America, Western Africa. This is really something which has become completely embedded into our way of working with our suppliers, supporting the community we are working with. Beyond the question of sourcing, we also include the gender dimension in the way we develop our product. Of course, we are selling beauty products and we have the women expectation at the core of our strategy, including in the eco-designs policy. We committed to eco-design 100% of our product, and now we put at disposal of the consumer, and especially in our case, women consumer, the environmental profile of the overall product so that they can choose and select the product which have the best environmental profile. So this is really something which is embedded into the value chain. But to go faster, because time is running on the topic, we've decided within the L'Oréal Foundation to dedicate a specific line of program to the question of women and climate. This has started this year, and the aim is really to support and empower women that are already leading climate action, being women in cities. We have a strategic partnership with the C40 cities, an international mentorship program called Women for Climate Initiatives, through which we identify, support, mentor, and empower women that are leading climate action, just climate action in the cities, and also a strategic partnership with the NGO CARE, which is implementing a very pragmatic project in the rural areas where we know that women are, of course, impacted by climate change, but have also the power and the capacities to adapt their own activities and the whole activities of their community in front of that climate change. So this is really an overall approach, both within the value chain, but also to go faster through additional levers, such as this new program within L'Oréal Foundation.
Thank you, Rachel. And you mentioned, you touched on something really interesting, the role of the cities. And we've seen a COP, I was fascinated by seeing the approach and the emerging voice of mayors of big cities. You mentioned C40. Let's, remind whoever is watching, this is a major network of 97 major cities. It represents about 700 million people, pretty much a quarter of the global economy. And at C40 was able to mobilize an international alliance of investors to deliver about $1 billion for zero emission buses in Latin America, something very concrete that came out of COP26. And a lot of people are now seeing the work and the role of mayors as really a source of hope, and potentially actually as even conversations emerging saying that we can actually make sure that the 1.5 degree target stays alive if cities are driving this change. Senator Heine, what is your perspective, obviously, of COP? I mean, we've been asked many times, was he a failure? Was he a success? Obviously, it does depend on the perspective that you take, the conditions in which you are. But could you give me a sense of how you see the outcome of COP26 when it comes, obviously, to the Marshall Islands?
Well, obviously, where I'm sitting, we're about to be submerged, in the mid-century, and expectation from COP26 was countries will come in and increase their commitments or their targets, and also increase their commitments toward financing for vulnerable countries, so that vulnerable countries can carry on adaptation as needed to secure their communities. But that didn't happen. Most of the countries that were expected to increase their targets didn't do that. I mean, we're speaking about Australia in the Pacific region. They are our neighbors, and they didn't even, try to increase their targets. So I think the leaderships of countries tend to talk a lot about this because people like to hear about it. But when it comes down to action, it doesn't happen. Financing, as far as the 100 billion that is required under the Paris Agreement, didn't even get there. It was supposed to be reached by last year, and here we are in 2021, and that was not met because, again, I think a lot of the countries are dragging their feet as if this is going to go away. Which is very disappointing for countries like Marshall Islands, where we're seeing the impact of climate change on everyday lives and livelihoods. So although there was some progress being made between now and whenever these require commitments are met, a lot would happen to countries like, a lot of the vulnerable communities. And so the time for action was now. We cannot wait for another, 5 years before actions are being taken. 1.5, according to the calculations, we may not continue to maintain that given the current commitments by countries. So that's another very disappointing result from COP26, because without 1.5 countries like the Marshall Islands will definitely submerge. So, I mean, it's very difficult for us to say that the recent COP produced positive results, because overall for us, it's very, very disappointing.
Ikal, I'm coming to you. I know you're drinking right now, but obviously I would like to have your reaction to COP26 when it comes to Indigenous community, whether it comes to first representation, which we know was an issue that was also underscored at COP, and also when it comes obviously to the outcome of COP26 itself.
Thank you. So yes, representation was
I think we're just having a slight problem in
a big problem. Of course, the vaccine appetite network is a bit flaky, but yes. So one thing, yeah, I'm having a little bit of a problem. Yes. So one, yes, the ag representation was definitely one of the big problems. But secondly, I think as we talk about the climate crisis, we've got to, again, as I say, the issue of corporate takeover. The fact that almost, no offense to corporate representatives, but the entire
I really would love to know what Ikal has to say.
entire process is sort of controlled by the corporates and has started to be recognized.
I think we're having.
I put on my video so that you can.
Yes, please.
Better if I put off my.
Ikal, have another go. You were talking about the corporate role, and then
yes, because sorry, because that when you're talking about really walking away from fossil fuels when 80% of the support that is, the corporates that are supporting the COP, a lot of the exhibitions are fossil fuel companies. It is a little scary, because then it means that they are then now positioning themselves to what then do they do to make a profit. And I think that is very scary for a lot of the local communities, for Indigenous communities, because it means that there is no fair playground for them. When you're the one serving the tea, then you determine who gets a cup and who doesn't get a cup. And in this particular case, this is what COP26, what happened at the COP26. That means that a lot of the, island communities, Indigenous communities, local populations were not able to access certain places because it was controlled by the few. And I guess for me and where I sit, the climate crisis is not only about ecological change. It is about equity. It is about, social and economic. And unless we really start to see what the climate crisis is for that, it means that we then constantly give priority to the corporate companies to then, and if you look at the conversation, it was always about technological change, but it is not only about technological change that we will address this climate crisis. We've got to really think about what Rachel from L'Oreal is talking about, women, equity, because as long as we do not address that, then we continue to leave people behind and the stakes continue. So unless we really address it from that corporate capture, because corporate capture is what then determines what is discussed, what is put on the table, what solutions are given. And I guess that's where, Jorian's position around, do we then treat it as a human right or as a legal? And that's where, there has to be, it's an intersection, because then when we talk about polluter pays, we talk about polluter pays in very bits and pieces. And so even in this, you find that the discussion at COP26 moved away from, walking away from fossil fuels to saying, over time, it's we're no longer really trying to say we've got to 1.5 degrees, but we're just saying, how do we make sure that we the corporate companies, we the oil companies do not lose? And yet right now, people like senators, communities are actually losing, across. Kiribati is constantly on the news about the loss, but also in Africa, you see farming communities and pastoralist communities continue to suffer. So you see this. So it again is a skewed situation where somebody is always at the cost of the people who are living on less than $1 every day, while we continue seeing the increase in profit across the corporate companies.
Thank you, Ikal, for this perspective. It's interesting. You talk about economies that are fair, sustainable, and participatory, which is exactly the framework of our inclusive economies program. So you also talked about, obviously, the culture of companies, and Jorian, culture of companies reflects on the legal approach that corporates take. How are you advising your clients? And what kind of response are you getting from there? Who are the early adopters? Obviously, I'm not asking you to disclose names, but which sector, perhaps if you can give us an idea, are embracing this shifting narrative?
Yeah. Okay. So the interesting part is that, because of the shift that we're seeing in this narrative and climate change becoming a human rights issue, it basically means that companies need their corporate lawyers. So this is great for us, because we can play an active role in trying to solve the climate change issue. And whatever way you look at it, and I very much understand and hear Ikal's concerns about corporate actors, and we need the business community to join us in the fight against climate change. And I very much notice in talking to my clients that this is becoming a boardroom issue, very much so, because everyone understands that there are liability risks in ignoring human rights implications of climate change. And that is very much what we as a firm are telling our clients, and other lawyers, I presume, are doing the same. And yes, there are laggards. There are those who are less active, and for them, the liability risk is really a stick, so to say. It's a reason to become more active. And then there are those, and we're also advising those companies like L'Oreal, who were already active in this field and who've set very ambitious goals. And this change in the narrative is only a further reason to thoroughly consider directions and set ambitious goals. So there's a lot happening in this space, and both in-house lawyers and external legal advisors are stepping up their game to play their role in combating climate change. And I wanted to come back briefly on what Senator Heine said about the failure of the Western communities to meet their finance commitments. I think that is an absolute disgrace, and this has been going on basically since the Rio Convention and the Framework Convention in 1992, and it's something that should be the headlines of our newspapers every single day until this is solved. Because in the end, the climate crisis is indeed about equity, and equity, as you know, is also a legal concept, so that comes very close to my legal reasoning as well. And reframing the narrative here is definitely part of the equitable solution.
Thank you, Jorian. I don't know if Senator Heine, you want to reply to that in particular. If not, I wanted to ask something to Rachel, but Senator Heine, I don't know if you want to jump in here.
No, go ahead.
Rachel, we talked about corporate culture, we talked about liability risks, and one of the issues that we are obviously witnessing is this emergence of ESG narratives becoming even more predominant in boardrooms, and this shift from CSR narratives to ESG risks, liabilities, but also opportunities. Can you give us the corporate perspective when it comes to L'Oréal and how you are embracing this the whole ESG narrative and framework?
Well, this is not something which is new at L'Oréal, of course. We had in the past already a first generation of sustainability ambition and targets with a first program ending back in 2020. So we are now in clear acceleration of sustainability ambition, a profound and radical transformation of our practices. And if I come back to the theme of and the topic of our conversation today, well, I can, of course, only agree with what Ikal and Jorian said. We do have now all together as business, grassroots organizations, experts, legal people, to consider much more the human dimension of climate change in every kind of climate change mitigation or adaptation intervention. This is really something that we put at the core of our activity. But this is not just about climate change. This is also about biodiversity conservation, about water, fight against water scarcity, circular economy. So all these environmental domains are, of course, backbone by and must do and will go with social inclusion only and justice only. Otherwise, we won't be able to achieve the targets, individual target for our company, but also a collective target with this 1.5 degree trajectory, which is of course our ambition. So I would not. Maybe there is a shift in the narrative. I think that committed companies in the past remain more than ever committed now, accelerating their efforts towards sustainability and climate justice. And probably there is a new wave of companies that are raising their awareness about the importance of catching the topic and putting these kind of issues at the core of their business strategy. I would not talk about a shift at L'Oréal. This is really a strong continuity to what we did before in terms of human rights protection, in terms of climate engagement, women's support, probably an acceleration rather than a shift, and not only about the narrative, but also about the actions. This is really, can be helpful to change the narrative, but what is really core, and it's super important, is really to change the nature of the intervention to make sure that the human dimension is always included in our climate interventions.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I really want to say thank you to all of you for joining us for this fascinating panel, in particular to Senator Heine. It's 11 p.m. where you are. So thank you so much for taking the time and being with us. It's been a fascinating conversation spanning multiple geographies, and I guess a conversation we could continue for many hours. Unfortunately, we are up for time. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Senator Heine. Thank you, Ikal. Thank you, Jorian. It's been really a pleasure having you with us. And let's continue the conversation today at Trust Conference. Thank you very much.